This episode is brought to you by SEATS, the education operations platform trusted by universities, colleges, and education providers worldwide. Timetabling in one system, attendance in another, compliance in a spreadsheet. Sound familiar? SEATS brings scheduling, engagement, compliance, and campus operations onto one AI-powered platform, built on Microsoft Azure, native to Teams and Power BI, audit-ready from day one. And the results? Retention up 20% at leading institutions. That's millions in tuition fee income protected and thousands of students who stayed the course. Want to start a pilot or just talk through your requirements? Go to seats1.com. Seats, one platform, every operation, supporting every student. I'm Susanna Marsden, a higher education consultant who helps to develop and support HE institutions in the UK and beyond. This podcast takes a deep dive into the roles of people who work in this hugely varied higher education sector. Each episode reveals what's involved in a specific role, the career path that led to it, and tips on how to get in and get on in these jobs. My guest in this episode is Andy Youell, whose 35-year career of working in and with higher education data systems and governance has resulted in him being very much the go-to sector guru in the field. While data may appear to be about numbers and systems, Andy's approach to getting things right in the sector is very much about people and the surrounding culture, capability and confidence. We discuss Andy's career with sector bodies, his freelance consultancy and a brief stint working within a university, as well as the advisory role he's played on numerous occasions, including to government ministers. His extensive career also enables him to offer us a potted history of how the HE data landscape has evolved across the last 3 decades, and we talk about how institutions have responded to that and what needs to come next, including for governing bodies. We also reflect upon some classic data topics such as data burden and single source of truth, and if data is a science or an art. Andy, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you as my guest in this episode. Your LinkedIn profile headline is notable. It says 35 years in higher education. What does that 35 years look like in relation to your career path so far?
Gosh, it is a long time, isn't it? And I look at that and I do start to feel a bit old and grey around the edges. So 35 years in higher education is the vast majority of my career. I spent 4 years working for Rolls-Royce in something called the defence industry before that. So it's been almost my entire career. I left Rolls-Royce as a result of something called the peace dividend. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and so defence spending was cut, which is perhaps ironic given where we are now. And then, yes, I joined a body that had just moved to Bristol called the Polytechnics and Colleges Funding Council. My first job there in 1991 was to run something called HESIS, the data collection, and that was really the start of it. So 35 years in HE, nearly 40 years in data. And I sort of look back on it, and so it's 4 decades doing this stuff. In data and technology terms, we often refer to Moore's law, and you might have heard of Moore's law. That's the idea that our processing technology becomes doubly more powerful every couple of years. That dates back to 1965. So Moore's law is 60 years old, and I've been working in data and systems for about 40 years, so about 2/3 of the era of Moore's law. So I've seen huge changes in technology. Obviously, data is faster, it's much bigger. We deal with huge volumes of data now. And the thing that really interests me, and the thing I do keep coming back to, is I'm increasingly not interested in the technology. I'm interested in our relationship with the technology, and our relationship as individuals and our relationship as organizations with the technology. The technology is ubiquitous, it is personal. And I sometimes refer to this. When I started work at HESA in the mid-90s, we had the biggest file servers that Dell had ever built at that point. and my mobile phone now has 10 times the amount of storage that those file servers had. So I could sort of run 10 HESAs on my iPhone, which is bonkers when you think about it.
And you talk there about your first role in higher education. What were the subsequent roles that you took after that time?
I joined the Polytechnics and Colleges Funding Council at a time when it was preparing to merge with the Universities Funding Council and become HEFC, the Higher Education Funding Council, in 1992. So there was a lot of change, and therefore there was a lot of opportunity. I spent the first, I think, 5 years working at the Funding Council. And as a part of that, I was involved in setting up this thing called HESA, and working on the early data specifications. And I was, for a couple of years, I was the HEFC representative around the HESA table. And then in 96, HESA offered me a job to look specifically at issues around data quality and improving the quality of HESA data. And so, having run data collections at the Funding Council for a few years, I jumped at the opportunity to get into that. I spent about 2 decades at HESA before stepping out on the freelance path in 2018. So the bulk of my career has been in that space, and I've sort of moved then onto, shall I say, onto the other side of the fence, if that's not too controversial.
Clearly, from what you said, your career has been hugely varied so far, a lot of time working for sector bodies, as well as the advisory and consultancy work. But you just mentioned there going over to the other side, and it was about 30 years into your career, you went to work in a university. How did you find that shift, and how did you find institutional life?
Looking back, it felt like a big change at the time, but it was probably more of a flow from the sector body into consultancy and then into an institution. It was a huge learning moment for me, because I think actually being inside an institution, I got to engage with many issues that I'd worked with at HESA and at the Funding Council, but from the institutional perspective. And I also had to work with and engage with a whole raft of issues that are entirely beyond the scope of bodies like HESA and HEFC and the OFS. So there is a whole load of stuff around, the delivery of teaching and learning and all of that stuff that was entirely new to me. The other thing that happened at that point was my role within the institution shifted from being just about data to actually becoming a sort of CIO role. I ended up taking on responsibility for everything IT and digital as well, and that was a huge learning curve. Looking back on it, I think the thing that really sticks with me is that I think up until that moment, I'd spent most of my career in a position where students were data points. And working for HESA, we were collecting about 3 million student records a year. And you get very blasé about the number 3 million. Yeah, it's a very big number. And I started going to graduation ceremonies. And if you look on LinkedIn, people in the sector, you will always get a lot of posts during the summer about graduation ceremonies and how important they are, and what a really sort of emotional experience it is, because you have people who have given so much of their life to developing their skills and achieving their higher education qualifications. And it's a huge event, a huge celebration. My first graduation ceremony, I saw these people, and I thought, my word, they're not data points. They're people, and each one has a story to tell, and each one is on a journey through their life, and each one is at a pivotal moment as they graduate from higher education. And so, yeah, there's a sense in which those data points became reality.
And we're going to talk in a moment about your self-employed work that you've gone back into, having finished that time in the institution. Do you miss graduation ceremonies now you're back in the world of consulting?
I do. They are special events. Having taken on a role on a governing body, I am now able to attend graduation ceremonies, although unfortunately this year's graduation ceremony was arranged for the week I was on holiday, so I wasn't able to attend it. But I am looking forward to getting back to graduation ceremonies, because it's a celebration, it's a festival. And, for all the challenges that we face and all the difficulties that we have day in, day out, I think it is a wonderful moment for the community of an institution to come together and celebrate what has been achieved. And that's kind of life affirming, I think.
So you're back in self-employed mode now as a consultant, and you've been doing that again since 2024. What's been the main focus of your work during the last couple of years?
So it is, as it previously was, a sort of combination of data work and systems work. Although having had more systems experience during my employment stint, I'm probably doing more systems work now than data work. Of course, these issues are always very closely related. So I've been working with higher education institutions. I have been working with technology suppliers as well, and organisations who are considering entering the higher education marketplace. A lot of the work I do, there are themes that keep coming up. I'm still doing a lot of work around what I might call data capabilities. And there's a phrase I find myself keep saying. I'm always commissioned using the words data and systems, but I always end up talking about people. And I always end up talking about culture, capability, and confidence. And in many ways, confidence is the one that I keep coming back to, because so many people still, in this day, so far after Moore's Law, there are many people out there who are still, if not terrified, at least very apprehensive and very nervous about data and the technology. And so confidence, I think, is a huge issue. So I spend quite a lot of my time helping people, get to a point of saying, it's not so scary. We're all dealing with data. We're all data professionals. Nowadays, if you have a university email address, you can cause a data breach. And you are therefore a data professional. You're processing data, and we need to get to a point where we're comfortable with that. So I do a lot on the person side, and I do a lot around systems work, systems governance, systems implementation, system reviews, and so on.
And reflecting on the full range of work you've done over the past 35 years in and with the sector, what is it that's kept you motivated to stay in the higher education sphere?
So the first thing I have to say is that I enjoy it, and that, higher education, for all of its challenges at the moment, is full of brilliant people who are working together to make the world a better place. Higher education is in many senses a superpower, because we can make the world a better place. We can cure some of the ills of the world through better education. And having spent a few years in an industry whose primary objective is killing people, that's quite refreshing. That's quite nice to be. But why do I stay? I guess with any role, there's a balance between what I offer in terms of generic or portable skills, the kind of things that could be applicable in any sector, in any industry, and then there is the knowledge and experience that I have, which is obviously specific to the UK higher education sector. And I think for me personally, because I have a range of knowledge and experience, and particularly that sort of sector level perspective, I think I can bring the greatest value to this sector probably in a way that I couldn't to other sectors. And also related to that, I think there is something about the network. So having been in higher education for all of these decades, I do now have quite an extensive network across the sector, and actually the ability to say, oh, I know someone who might be able to help with that, or I know an institution who's been through that issue, or this happened 10 years ago and this was the outcome there. And actually being able to have that network and that depth, I think it's really valuable. And I couldn't repeat that in any other sector. So I'm 57 years old. I've probably got to a point now where I'm a lifer now, aren't I, in higher education?
And I guess there's always something new to do, isn't there? There's always a different challenge. There's always a different client. There's always a different phase that we're going through as a sector.
Yes, there is, and the challenges are changing now as the sector faces probably a period of profound upheaval. And so the ability to draw on that knowledge, that history, and the ability to draw on that network, I think is probably more valuable now than it's ever been.
We've talked about the evolution of your career path over the past 35 years, and I'm keen for us to talk a bit more about the career path of data in HE during that time. How would you present and chunk up the HE data CV over those decades?
Gosh, the ages of data. I have seen a really interesting shift in our relationship with data. And as I said, I'm far more interested in our relationship with data and what that means for us as individuals and us as organizations. I often talk about the way the language around data has changed. When I was working at Rolls-Royce in the 1980s, I was doing something called business statistics. And I was submitting overnight batch jobs on a mainframe computer and generating business statistics. And at the age of 18, my mother was very proud of me. And that was the 1980s. In the 1990s, we lived through the era of management information, because I think information is perceived as being more valuable than statistics. Okay, it's richer. So so we sort of moved into that era. In the 2000s, the technology industry decided they wanted to sell us the latest stuff, and so the concept of business intelligence was born. Because obviously intelligence is better than information, right? So we all want a bit of that. And then in the 2010s, we stopped talking about business intelligence and we started talking about insight, because insight is almost like that Zen level being of having much greater depth of understanding. And so I think the way the language has changed, it reflects how our expectations have changed. And if Moore's law talks about the power of technology increasing exponentially, then maybe I should claim Youell's law as being the fact that our expectations about the value that we can derive from data have also increased exponentially. There is an organisation out there who I think have raised the bar to another level. And working in higher education, Suzanne, I'm sure you spend many happy hours studying the website of the Office for Students. If you look at their organogram, they have a department of data analysis and foresight, because foresight is better than insight, right? Foresight it's the next level up. And so they, I think, have raised the expectation to the next level. So yes, I think we have lived through those eras of data and we have seen our expectations rise exponentially.
And thinking about those different times, I mean, the data landscape, as you say, it's evolved in language, but also the use of data within institutions. It's now a far more embedded part of day-to-day institutional life, moving from what was pretty much a student number count through to now informing strategic decision-making, as well as that compliance role under the Office for Students. What are your reflections on how institutions themselves have evolved organisationally to respond to that more embedded use of data?
So I guess the first reflection I would offer is probably largely on the back of Moore's law and the developments in technology. When I started out in this career, data was an IT thing. And in fact, when we did the first HESA collections in 94 and 95, the people who were making the submissions were the IT departments. The very first HESA event I attended in the spring of 95, which was after the very first HESA collection in December 94, was organised by a body called UCISA, which is the Universities and Colleges Information Systems Association. It's the IT directors group. And the first event to look at how the HESA return had gone and what lessons we can learn from it. And the sector obviously is brilliant at bringing professional groups together like this. But it was owned by the IT directors. It was an IT thing because it was data, right? And what we have seen since then, I think, is the emergence of data as an issue and data as a professional skill and capability in its own right. So I think that's probably been the broad change. And again, the language I think is really interesting. We've seen the emergence of a role that's often under the label planning director. In the early 90s, universities might have had a planning officer who reported to the financial officer and did the student number plans, hence the planning bit. And that role has emerged and become something about driving value from data, using data to get insights and so on. It is often the planning directors who end up leading on the statutory returns and the engagement with the OFS and the use of the regulatory metrics and so on. And so we have seen that emergence of that professional capability. Alongside that, we have seen data become a legal issue. And, like I said just now, everyone's a data professional because we can all cause a data breach. So everyone has to deal with GDPR, right? And we all have to be trained on GDPR every year or two. And that's a universal thing. We all have to engage with this. And so data has become ubiquitous. We have seen particular threads of development. We have seen things like learner analytics. So the idea that we're now using data to try and identify students who are at a higher risk of withdrawing. We're seeing, the absolute brilliant work at the moment around the pre-arrival questionnaire, and getting a better understanding of students as they enter the higher education system. And you don't have to look very far outside of higher education to see some of the amazing things that are now being done with data in different sectors. And so I think there is still a long road to travel in terms of driving value from data.
And you and I, in our respective consultancy work, I mean, we've both worked with large universities and with small specialist institutions. I mean, thinking about what you've just been talking about there to do with the evolution of roles and teams and planning departments, etc., or even use of data, what are your observations about how that shifts between a really big university with 50,000 students like UCL to a small specialist which might only have 500 to 1,000 students?
I think scale is a huge challenge for institutions, and it's particularly a huge challenge when it comes to data and systems, because the systems that an institution has to have to support the student life cycle are fundamentally no different if you have 500 students or if you have 30,000 students. You still have to have an admissions process. You still have to have a student record system, a virtual learning environment, timetabling process, and so on. All of that stuff has to be in place. And so I think scale is a huge challenge for small institutions. As I keep ending up with the idea, it depends a lot on the people. And I think for large organizations, it also actually depends an awful lot on the culture. And there is something about having a culture within an organization that genuinely recognizes the significance of data and genuinely respects data, because we have all of this aspiration around data, but actually we have to look after it. I sometimes make a comparison with money, right? We've had money for 7,000 years, and we now understand what an accountant is. Right. And it's taken us 7,000 years to get there, but we now know what an accountant is. An accountant has, a professional status, a professional body. It is a regulated profession, qualifications, continuing professional development, all of that stuff. And so we know what an accountant is. We've had data of this scale and complexity only for the last couple of decades, and we're still working it out. Yeah, we're still working it out. When my kids were younger, I used to give them a bit of pocket money every month, and I'd give them a little speech about, you have to look after this. Here's £5. Spend it wisely. You have to look after this, because it's finite. It's precious. With data, we sort of have the opposite problem. Because of Moore's law, we've got more data, and we've got even more data. And then 2 years later, we've got twice the amount of data again. We've got too much data. So data is not perceived as precious in the way that it should be in many cases. And in many cases, data is not respected in the way it should be. So people go off and do things on spreadsheets and run amok with data and create all sorts of havoc around that. So I think we, as a culture, have and a society, I think we have got a lot of catching up to do to get to the place of the accountants.
Your comment there about spreadsheets may well come up in conversation with our next question I'm going to ask you. I want to pick up a bit more about student numbers data within institutions. And one of my vivid recollections of working in a university is student numbers being presented at executive committee meetings. And without fail, someone would say that part of that data was incorrect. It didn't match the data that was held in their school or faculty. Now, administrative error is, of course, possible in those situations, but as you wouldn't be surprised, it was rarely that issue. Within the sector, how do we get ourselves into that type of position? And is it possible to get out of it?
To answer your last question first, yes, it is possible to get out of it. And I think for many institutions, that is quite a long journey to undertake. I think in many cases, no, in fact, I think I would say in every case, that journey has to be at least recognised and supported from the very top of the institution, even if it is not explicitly led from the very top of the institution. Spreadsheets, in a sense, spreadsheets have become the great democratizer of data, right? Because everyone has a spreadsheet, has Excel on their desktop. And because of Moore's law, Excel can now do really big, powerful stuff. A single Excel worksheet can store 17.2 billion items of data. And there are only 8.3 billion people alive on the world today, right? So you can do huge things in Excel, and stuff that 20 or 30 years ago would have been a system and a systems development project with all of the controls and professionalism that goes around that. Because spreadsheets are now so powerful, we just knock stuff out on a spreadsheet with a complete lack of control and governance and oversight. And so the secret to getting back to this, I think that there's a whole load of stuff around controls, and so that kind of takes you down the management route, and there's a lot that can be done there. I think there's a whole piece around the governance of data and systems, and I think across the sector, I think they're at a very variable position around those sorts of issues. So there's management and there's governance, but above all of that, there is culture. And there is a culture about saying, we have to respect the central systems and we have to trust the central systems. And so there is something about the central systems, building trust. I often hear the phrase people talk about, they want a single source of truth. I like to tweak that slightly. I always like to talk about the single source of trust, because truth is a really nebulous concept when it comes to data, because there can be a myriad of truths out there in the real world, because the real world is so complex and messy. So I don't like to talk about a single source of truth. I like to talk about a single source of trust, because that speaks to the people, that speaks to the culture, and that, I think, frames this whole thing very much as an organisational culture issue, a lot more than it is about systems and wires and things.
You talked earlier about the far greater volume of data that the sector now has, and obviously that has its upsides of the sort that we were talking about earlier, to do with learning analytics or data to inform decision making. But the downside of the volume of data that we have is the compliance side of things. I mean, compliance is important, obviously, but there is an increased burden of managing that data and the external reporting requirements that are occurring or have occurred for some time across the sector. Across your career to date, you've been heavily involved in advising relevant bodies on how that sector burden can be reduced. What have been the main ways in which you've tried to influence any change?
The burden reduction agenda in higher education has a long and checkered history. And it introduces a whole batch of new acronyms into the conversation. So in the early 2000s, we had the HEFC accountability reviews. Then there was something called the BRTF, the Better Regulation Task Force, and we had the Higher Education Better Regulation Review Group. That was another acronym we lived with for a while. So burden has been an issue that has never been far from the surface, I think. And data burden is one element of burden. So I guess there are a couple of major areas that I've worked in. So the first one is something called HEDIP. This was the Higher Education Data and Information Improvement Programme. And this ran for 3 years between 2013 and 2016. So it finished a decade ago. And as director of HEDIP, I was tasked with redesigning the higher education data landscape because I love a challenge. Redesigning the higher education data landscape to come up with a system that reduced burden and delivered more value to users. This grew out of the 2011 white paper, Students at the Heart of the System. We got funding to run it across the UK and make it a proper UK-wide initiative. HEDIP did a number of things around, for example, data standardization. So we created the HECOS subject coding. We did a whole load of work around data capabilities and sort of really pushed that data management, data governance agenda, which is now flourishing in many other parts of the sector. The central thing within HEDIP was to come up with a model for the higher education sector that would reduce burden and increase the value that we can get from data. And we came up with this model that was involved. That involved an agenda of standardization of data, because at the moment everyone has their own data definitions. We can't agree what a course is and kind of that stuff. So there's something about standardizing data definitions. There's something about rationalizing the data collections. And those two agendas would be supported by an increase in data capabilities. And those two agendas would be overseen by governance. And we tried to put in place what we called at the time collective and consensual governance. And this was effectively a model of governance which had everyone buying into it because they wanted to. And that didn't work. Because as a principle, of course, everybody wants to buy into these agendas and make data better and reduce burden and stuff. But when it gets to those difficult moments, sometimes organisations will say, actually, we'd love to do this, but we have to go off and do something else now. And so we didn't have that hard model of governance. So there was that. A few years ago, I wrote a rather grumpy piece in Wonky, bemoaning some big announcement that the OFS made about burden reduction, which was actually some trifling changes. And I was quite grumpy because at the time I was working for a university that not only was doing all the OFS reporting, it was doing all the apprenticeship reporting and all of this duplication across the piece. And I wrote this grumpy piece in Wonky, and I called for the then Minister for Further and Higher Education, Michelle Donnellan, to actually do something about duplication rather than burden. We need to shift the conversation from burden to duplication. And that was amazing. Within 24 hours, I had her office on the phone, and we had some conversations. We ended up setting up something called the Higher Education Data Reduction Task Force, which I was never entirely convinced about the title, but we invited a number of bodies from around the sector to join us in meetings with some of the arm's length bodies, some of the data collection bodies. And then something very bizarre happened. We scheduled 6 meetings of this group. We conducted 3 of the meetings, and then the other 3 were cancelled, and the whole thing went silent. And despite numerous chases back to the department, we never heard another peep about that group. And there was an opportunity, and the minister attended the first of these meetings, and she was banging the table in the way that ministers sometimes do. Something must be done. But it was almost as though we were ghosted. And the whole thing paused. UUK and Guild AG lobbied for the group to be restarted, but unfortunately it never did.
I mean, since that time, we've probably had several prime ministers and governments since then. And it sounds to me like the task force idea was great and had a real focus to it. I mean, we have a new prime minister now. I mean, what hope do you have about work that can change into the future? Because the burden or the duplication continues to grow. So what hope do you have for that position being addressed in the short to medium term?
Yes, I think the burden does continue to grow. It does seem to be getting worse. And there are a number of areas that I think are causing a number of pain points at the moment. So we've got, the reintroduction of in-year HESA reporting, and the sector seems to be making very heavy weather of that. At the same time, we continue to do the ILR individual returns every month, and I can't rationalise those two. I'm saddened to see that data burden kind of has slipped off the agenda. There's a huge amount of other stuff going on, but it continues to inflict a massive cost on the sector, and it is something that the government could do, and it is a very positive step that the government could take without spending a lot of money. And I actually would go back to the HEDIC model, because I think the elements of the HEDIC model were right, and it's an agenda of standardisation and rationalisation overseen by governance. And what we never had after HEDIP was what I might call hard governance, governance with real authority, governance with real power. And I think there is an opportunity for the governments, and I would say that plural because I think it is a UK-wide issue. There is an opportunity for the governments across the UK to create some kind of governance model for the data landscape that has some real authority and that can drive some real change. Because I think without that, history tells us that all of these different bodies collecting data and demanding data, they will continue to operate in a largely unconstrained way. So I think there is an opportunity to do that. I think in the short term, at least, it shouldn't cost a lot of money, putting that in place. It's not like a big investment, but actually just having some proper governance around the landscape, I think would make a big difference.
So maybe we can share this podcast episode with those that might be able to act.
I think that would be marvellous.
Alongside your consultancy work and the wider work that you've done across the sector, you've mentioned already you are a university governor, and that gives you yet another perspective on how the sector is operating. And within the sector, we've recently received an updated version of the Committee of University Chairs, or CUC, Code of Higher Education Governance that was published in June 2026. What thoughts do you have? I mean, you talked earlier about all of us being data professionals. What thoughts do you have about how governors of institutions can best be supported and equipped in their engagement with the HE data landscape?
So having sat on both sides of this table, metaphorically, I get that it's really difficult, because, as a university governor, I have to engage with a huge range of issues. I mean, you recognise this, Susanna. You're governor of an HE institution, so there's a huge range of issues that we have to engage with. By their very nature, governing body meetings are severely time constrained. And there is a perpetual challenge for the executive to provide the governing body with enough information, but without overloading the governing body to get to a point where it is consumable. And I think that's a real challenge, and I don't have a cookie cutter simple solution to that. Given the current pressures that the sector is under, I think governing bodies absolutely need to understand things like, the OFSB3 statistics, what drives those. I think it would be really helpful if they had some understanding of how far removed those statistics are from reality, because the reality is the stuff that happens in institutions that goes into their data systems, that gets converted to HISA returns, that goes through some algorithm at the OFS and it spits out a number. It's a long way from that real world. So I think governing bodies need to have some understanding of that. And at the moment, I think it is really important that governing bodies have some understanding of the link between data and policy and government policy. And I guess the key example at the moment would be something like LEO, the longitudinal educational outcomes data, which links higher education data with the tax records 5 years after graduation. And this gives us the median salary 5 years after graduation. That drives something called the resource accounting and budgeting charge, the RAB charge at the DFE, which then drives how much of this year's student loan book gets written onto the national accounts. And you kind of need to understand these links from data to policy to national accounts, because that is actually what drives ministers to take decisions about, in this example, how the student finance system works in the various levers that go onto that. And I think governing bodies need to understand, therefore, why that data is important. They need to understand why the graduate outcomes data is so important, and therefore why the regulators and policymakers are so obsessed with those graduate outcome figures. We need to understand that context, because as data is used more by the funders and regulators and policymakers, we as institutional governing bodies need to have some understanding of that so that we can steer our institutions through this landscape.
I mean, it's a big responsibility, isn't it? I think for any governor on a governing body of an institution at the moment, with the volume of stuff going on and the amount of data that's presented. But it's interesting when we talked before about the data burden or data duplication. And of course, that creates a lot of work within an institution. And I'm just sort of thinking, bearing in mind how many institutions at the moment are needing to go through cost cutting and reflecting on where their resources are being spent. I guess it's also important for governors to understand that there are challenges beyond the institution that are impacting on the way in which things are operating.
Yes, there are. And I think there's something about putting these threads together then at this point, and I think this is interesting. So that yes, there is huge pain, huge burden, huge cost spent on making these data returns. Often that work is unnecessarily difficult and unnecessarily complex, and therefore unnecessarily expensive, because of issues upstream in the data chain within the institution, which takes us neatly back to that conversation about data management and data governance, and having a culture within the organisation that properly respects the importance of data. Because having been involved in doing some HISA returns now, and seen it through that angle, the process of doing a HISA return often is not the issue. The issue is upstream with the data, where the data we've got hasn't been kept up to date, it hasn't been quality assured, it's in a terrible state, and therefore the job that we call doing the HISA return is actually a massive data cleansing exercise for our data, which probably should have been a lot cleaner to begin with, dare I say it. So I think there is something about governing bodies having some understanding of how these various threads hang together. And of course, governing bodies should not have to engage with the minutiae of how to do a HISA return, but some understanding of that data flow from the student journey, the student reality, the systems, the reporting, the metrics, the statistics, the policy, and the government decision. Just have some understanding of that, because there are things that institutions could be doing to make that burden far less painful on themselves.
And moving back right inside the institution and thinking about staff a bit more, I mean, what are your reflections on how, as a sector, we're recruiting and supporting the professional development of colleagues to best manage and use data in day-to-day institutional life?
I think it is improving, but I think there is still a long way to go. I think every job description should say something about responsibilities for data, because we're all data professionals. We can all cause a data breach. So every job description should say something about responsibilities of data. I think it's quite a varied picture across the sector. But I do see things that encourage me. I see things, obviously, the rise of the planning community, HESPA, and the other groups that operate in that space, the academic registrars and the student records officers and so on. And so actually this wealth of communities that exist across the sector, I think they bring enormous value. I am particularly delighted to see the work that universities' HR are doing around data skills and data capabilities, and actually getting to a point where the HR professionals themselves are becoming more confident in the use of data. Historically, I have met many HR professionals who are absolutely terrified of data because they tell me they're people, they don't do data. And it's like, that's the whole point. It's about people. So I am so pleased to see what universities' HR are doing around this. So I think there are some really good initiatives going on around capabilities and confidence around data. But I think there is still an awfully long way to go.
We talked at the start of the episode about the evolution of data across the last 35 years. Looking to the future, it's probably unwise and certainly unsafe to predict the next 35 years, but finishing up our conversation today and maybe looking at the next few years, the foresight that you mentioned earlier, what do you think will be the most notable changes in the HE data landscape that we'll be grappling with?
There's probably a pessimistic one and there's probably an optimistic one. The pessimistic one, I think, is a conversation about the amount of what's known as technical debt across the sector. And this is the result of decades of poorly managed, uncontrolled growth in data and systems. And the fact that now in the majority of institutions across the sector, I think there are now significant problems with the complexity, the number of quick fixes that have been made historically, which get baked into systems, and the cost of maintaining this complexity. And the thing is, without significant intervention, things will start to break. And so I think without a significant reset around data and systems governance, and this is happening in some institutions, but without that, I think we will head inexorably to a situation where our systems cost us ever more, they become ever more unstable, and things fall over with increasing regularity. That's my pessimistic prediction, and I think without intervention that will happen. A positive note to end on, I think there is something about data skills, and I will, as I always end up doing, come back and talk about people. I think we will get to a point where we will recognise that driving value from data is less about programming and maths, and it's more about being able to understand what the data does and does not tell us about the real world, and then being able to contextualize that, create a narrative, and then being able to communicate that to an audience. All right. So I think we're heading to a point where the world is starting to recognize that being good at data is not a technical thing, it's not a science thing, it is an art. And it is the art of understanding and interpreting data, and it is the art of communicating data to your audience. And I think the more we understand that, the better we shall be.
And is that a human art or an AI art?
Oh gosh, that's a human art.
Andy, it's been a real pleasure talking with you today. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Susanna, it's been a real privilege. Thank you very much.
The Association of Higher Education Professionals and the British University's Finance Directors Group, BUFDOG, are both proud to support Job Shadowing HE as a valuable source of professional insight. The podcast was presented by Susanna Marsden, and you can find out more about her consultancy work at susannamarsden.co.uk. Audio production and music was by me, Rodri Marsden. Find out more about this podcast and hear previous episodes at jobshadowinghe.com.